Hello and welcome to The Future of Business, where each week we discuss current business issues that will have a significant impact on the future of business in Ireland and beyond, and explore their possible consequences for people in business and in society more generally. I'm Vincent Wall, and today I'm joined by Mark Kennedy, Managing Partner, Mazars Ireland, to discuss the growing responsibility of business leaders to commit to a broader range of objectives than simply financial reporting. Mark, this can be discussed under a number of titles: sustainability, the changing board agenda, profits, people, planet. But broadly speaking, it probably makes sense for business leaders, board members, to think about wider issues than just financial reporting. Now it's a requirement on them to do so.
Yeah, I think that's the big change in the last number of years. I mean, this idea and particularly the profit, people, planet concept is not new. It's been knocking around for the last 20 years or so. And I suppose debated widely both in more academic circles and then gradually in the business world. And really since the global financial crisis, this has become much more front and centre, and we've had a greater level of social interest in, I suppose, society and gradually government and the EU most recently getting very involved in this debate. And so in 2017, we've seen the first legislation that started to filter through in that way. And in 2017, the EU passed a directive which has been brought into law here in Ireland as part of our company law regulations, which is glories in the title of disclosure of non-financial and diversity information by certain large undertakings and groups.
Good old EU, they always brand things
make it
well.
nice and interesting. But essentially what that bit of legislation now means that from this year end, from the end of 2018, companies above a certain size will be required to report on 5 things which they haven't done so before. One is environmental matters, second is social employee matters, human rights, bribery and corruption, and the last thing is they'll have to give more information about their business model. So it's gone from being a discussion point and really an academic development to now we have this in law, and companies and business leaders need to start thinking seriously about how their businesses will react to this.
And before we get into the kinds of things that come under these parameters and where people might seek some guidance, will there be any consequences, do you think, if directors, if business leaders don't take this new requirement seriously enough?
I think there will, and as in all things, I suppose we're in a transition phase, so these things will be gradual. But if we now have a piece of company law, an EU set of company regulations, the first thing is that auditors will be required to report on it. So we are, as the auditing profession is required to say whether a company complies with companies' legislation or not. So now this is going to be part of that canon, and therefore we're going to have to mention in the audit report. The second consequence is it's actually it's under Irish company law, it's an offence not to comply. So in all of these things there's a comply or explain rule. So if you're not deemed to be hitting the mark in the right way, your auditor, first of all, will call it out, and then the regulator, the accounting regulator, IASA, may have issues and ultimately can take a case under company law against the board for not complying.
Do you think more significantly there could be reputational damage, reputational implications?
Absolutely, and I think that's really where things become more challenging for boards. And in particular, I think the investor community is starting to focus on these kind of issues. And I thought it's very interesting. If you look at earlier in the year, Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock and probably represents one of the biggest investment organisations in the world, he came out in an interview in the FT and said that the ability of companies to manage the interaction with environmental, social and governance matters demonstrates whether they can grow sustainably or not. And BlackRock are now building that kind of issue into how they assess investment opportunities. And if BlackRock are doing it, I suspect lots of their peers are beginning to do it as well.
What do you think is actually driving this? I mean, apart from the actual legislation that's coming in, what wider social dynamics are actually driving this?
Well, I think there's one or two things that are kicking in. I think an issue like climate change of itself has become so much a talking point, and beyond a talking point, so much a concern for many people that there's a societal push, and companies, because of their economic activity, are driving some of the behaviours that lead to climate change. So I think that you have that kind of social issue, and I would put with that then, I suppose, diversity issues,
gender issues.
Yeah, gender issues, some of the employment issues. I mean, you talk about 0-hour contracts, a big issue in the UK, bit of an issue here as well in terms of the even during the week, I know the Revenue have made a finding in relation to bogus self-employment arrangements. So those kind of issues are gathering pace. And I think you have, in the new world of social media, activists are far more equipped to bring those issues to the fore. And from a brand perspective for a company, you can be singled out and it can do your brand damage in a very real way very quickly. And we've seen examples of that. So I think that is a driver in society generally. I think the second thing is that there's a long body of research which shows that companies which act in a sustainable way tend to last longer, tend to produce better returns for investors in the long term. And that's driving it as well. So the investor community and business leaders are looking at it themselves. And probably the catalyst for a lot of it was the financial crisis, because people looked at not just banks that failed, but I mean, we had the motor industry in the US, came very close to toppling over. You had many businesses here in this country who had probably made unwise business model decisions and suffered as a consequence, not because of their own making in terms of the banking crisis, but they were then not able to withstand that. So I think a lot of people in business are thinking about these kind of issues as a consequence of that particular event.
You're dealing with companies on a daily basis. I mean, from your experience, would I be right in thinking that not a lot of directors, business leaders are aware of this new requirement?
I think that's fair. I was speaking at an event in the IOD recently in the Institute of Directors, and we did a little bit of a straw poll, and I think out of about 100 we had one or two nervously put their hand up and said yes, they were aware of the legislation. It hasn't got a lot of fanfare. And it's not the director's fault they don't know about it. I mean, I think there's a role for professionals like myself, for the bodies like the CRO, the department to actually make a bit of noise about these things. And I think as we go towards year end, you'll start to see that debate happen.
And even by Irish standards, the firms that have to comply with this legislation they're not enormous organisations.
That's correct, and it's a very important point, because while the legislation refers to certain large undertakings, you've got to go back to the Companies Act then and figure out, well, what's a large undertaking. A large undertaking is still defined as something which turns over 40 million a year and has a balance sheet of 20 million and has more than, I think, 250 employees, if I recall correctly. So you're talking about a class of company that isn't that large. On top of that, then you have to add in everything which is a public interest entity. And again, a lot of regulated businesses, smaller insurers, for example, they may have only a handful of employees, but because they're regulated, they are deemed to be in this category as well. So actually, it could be quite a significant number of businesses need to think about this. And it is, I always believe there's a trickle-down effect as well, so that the larger companies will adopt it. You'll start to see it become best practice, I think, over 5-10 years as well. So a lot of other companies need to start thinking about that.
But for that cohort that's encompassed by the legislation, that report, these new reports, if companies aren't doing it already, have to be in their 2018 annual report.
Exactly. So there will be a non-financial report in their annual reports from 2018 on. That's the requirement now. And that will cover these issues and probably some other issues that directors are required to give a view on in relation to their company. And I think the important thing, you can look at it as a compliance requirement, and there is a risk that boards may look at it and say, okay, what's the boilerplate? What's the minimum we can get away with? The difficulty with that is that the type of topic that is being put front and centre here, if I take, for example, the business model, or if you take the social and employee matters, the KPIs that you set out and that you report on, that you start to describe, will be looked at by outsiders in the future. And they say, well, are you progressing against the policies that you've set out, the goals you've made? And you may be opening yourself to criticism, and your brand standing may be open to some criticism if you get that wrong.
For instance, you could buy something off the shelf, for instance, that you mightn't give too much attention to, that commits you to a certain level of gender balance within a time frame. That is now open public information that you could be measured against.
That's exactly the point. So I think the onus is on boards now to be thoughtful about what are the standards they set, what are the KPIs that they want to report on, and to take that seriously. And, you know, it's each to their own. It's appropriate to the company and to the business they're in. So not everybody has to deal with everything in the grand scale. It may be quite small steps that you're pointing out and taking, but at least take them seriously and report faithfully on them, I think is the message. And that way you're doing your brand a favour.
And broadly speaking, you know, in broad terms, what are the areas that business leaders need to think about in terms of reporting on how they're doing now, what their objectives are? Like, what are these non-financial KPIs that we're talking about? Unfortunately,
the legislation is, aside from setting out the 5 matters that I've mentioned, there isn't a lot of great guidance on it. The EU has issued a set of guidelines which are non-binding. They're illustrative more than anything else. They're again very principle-based, and they do focus on certain areas. I would have said, if I was advising somebody today, what are the kind of things that you should be starting with? I think you certainly should start with the social and employee areas. I think issues like diversity, gender balance and so on is something that every business should be thinking about. There's great guidance out there. If you look around even the internet, you'll find there's plenty of work has been done in that area. We're also going to have a piece of legislation on pay gap reporting coming in the next year or two. If that will be added onto this, and again, so that's